Good afternoon. Thank you very much for joining another series of my podcast, Rumination with Andrew. Today, we are going to be opening up our conversation, and we are still going to continue on the U.S. imperium. Now, you might ask me, why are you delving so much? Why are you talking so much about the U.S. empire? But it's very, very important that we understand the empire that rules the world, right? The empire that governs the world, the empire that controls the world. And we did say prior to, in a previous video rather, that the word imperium or empire comes from that Latin phrase imperium or imperial, all right? Imperial, right? And imperare, which is the infinitive, which means to control or to subjugate, right? To dominate. These are some of the meanings of that infinitive imperare, which, the word imperium, the noun imperium is derived. All right, so we have to take stock of the imperium, and we are seeing a lot of wars being waged in the world. And we understand that wars, right, do match with imperialism. It goes with imperialism and empire, right? So we've got to understand that. Now, I want to open up my discussion here this afternoon with a biblical quote, right? With a biblical passage, and it's taken from Psalm 49, and I'm going to begin from verse 12 and move on to other verses. Now, verse 12 says, "Nevertheless, man being in honor abideth not. He is like the beasts that perish." And it says here in verse 16, "Be thou not afraid when one is made rich, when the glory of his house is increased." Let's move on to the end of the passage. "For when he dieth, he shall carry nothing away. His glory shall not descend after him. Though while he lived, he blessed his soul, and men will praise thee when thou doest well to thyself. He shall go to the generation of his fathers, that they shall never see light." Man that is in honor and understandeth not is like the beasts that perish. So it's very important that we understand that we are not in control of our own lives. We are not in control of our destiny, because even though God might shower us with lots of blessings, but if we do not understand that these blessings come from him and that the praise is due to his name alone, if we compile those blessings and think that we are the ones who are the originators of those blessings, and then we begin to use those blessings to inflict harm and danger on people, the Bible is suggesting to us here that man that is in honor, that you respect, that has accumulated a lot of wealth, right? And that the entire world, pays their obeisance to. They respect him or her. If he or she understandeth not, is that person can be compared to the beast that perishes, right? So it means, therefore, that we are not as important as we think we are, that God is the one who should get the praise and the honor, because God cannot die. He is the immortal, invisible God, right? So all of these nations, these empires, they come up and they go, right, at the dictate of God. It is God who sets them up, and it is God who puts them down. Now, let me segue now into a question, because one of the things, how do we understand the US empire? We've got to read our Bibles, right? Even though God has given man lots of knowledge, and he allows man to shed light on some things in the Bible and to confirm them, right? It doesn't mean, therefore, that they are the ones to whom to go, right? They are not the end all be all, right? We have to seek wisdom from the fountain. We understand in Colossians that God himself, Christ himself, is the fountain, is the treasure of all wisdom and knowledge and understanding. Now, regardless of what we say, and all the calculus books and the biology books and the books on cultures and language and all the books, and men have written some very good books, right? Because we know that all knowledge comes from God. So it means, therefore, that they got their knowledge from him. The sad thing about the world in which we live, particularly academia, Western academia, that because we can only talk about Western academia because God has given and shed much light on Western academia, and they have rejected him. Because right now the professor, right, is now the God of many of these universities. It's not God who should be the source of all wisdom and understanding. Now, this is an article coming from, is it coming from Medium? I think it's from the Medium newspaper. I think so. And the Medium newspaper, it's a newspaper, right, is not any fringe newspaper, right? It's a mainstream newspaper. It says here, the best-selling book, let me see if I can close this here, because it is blocking my screen. Yeah, okay. The best-selling book, number one, is Reading. Why the Bible really is literature. Oh, sorry. I thought the best-selling book, no one is reading. I'm sorry. I misread. This is not number, but it's no one is reading. So the best-selling book, no one is reading, why the Bible really is literature. All right. And it says it's not just a dusty old religion textbook. All right. So, I mean, he opens up with a poem by Bruce Springsteen, right? The price you pay. But we just want to delve into a couple of the ideas here that he shared with us. You may wonder why an article about the Bible as literature would start with lyrics from Bruce Springsteen. Though if you haven't read much of my stuff, you may not. I write about him a lot. See two examples at the end of this piece. I start with the lines from The Price You Pay because they reference a famous Old Testament story that people who have never read the Bible would miss completely, which make them the perfect jumping off point. If you ask people to name the best-selling book of all time, some will say the Da Vinci Code or one of the Harry Potter books. But the fact is, the Bible is still the best-selling book in America. Despite the great sales numbers, however, it is also the least read book in America today. All right. So he says here, don't get me wrong, most people in America own a Bible. So they do, in fact, have Bibles on their book stand, right, in their libraries. And a large number own more than one. But to borrow the line from a less biblical question, 90% of people don't read the Bible, and the other 10% lie about it. So it means, therefore, that we're living in some very, very dark times, because the Bible said, well, thy word is a light unto my, a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path. Thy word is a lamp unto my feet and a light onto my path. Even many regular churchgoers in the Bible Belt only dust off their copy long enough to carry into Sunday services. They then toss it into the back seat of their SUV until the next week. All right, so we are living in some serious times, because remember now that Western civilization is built on Christian values and principles, and they do not come magically, right? They come by the study, a diligent study of the word of God. And if we have lost those norms and those customs and those traditions and those values, it is because we are no longer reading the word of God. Now, remember now, the founding fathers of the United States were not avowed Christians. Many of them were not avowed Christians. They weren't passionate. They were not devout Christians, right? But what they were Bible literate. They had a Bible literacy, right? That was second to none, right? And they also studied the histories of different cultures and civilizations, and they understood that the civilizations that studied the Bible and followed biblical principles were the civilizations that lasted a little longer and prospered more. All right. So I just wanted you to keep that in mind. The question we would like to ask in our discussion or for discussion today is the United States an empire, right? And is it the greatest threat to world peace? That is the poignant question, right? Is America the greatest threat to world peace? And we're going to look here from, and this is coming from the Guardian newspaper, that's the United Kingdom, from the UK Guardian newspaper, not the one from Trinidad. They have various Guardian newspapers. You have Guardian, I think, one in Trinidad and one in also Nigeria. But this is coming from the Guardian newspaper in the UK. And the title of the article is US seen as bigger threat to democracy than Russia or China, global poll finds. Now look at this data. It's dated on May the 5th, 2021. So that's not a long time ago. We're not talking about 2025. And you think that, oh, things might have changed since then. All right, here what it says: the US faces an uphill task presenting itself as the chief guardian of global democracy, according to a new poll that shows the US is seen around the world as more of a threat to democracy than even Russia and China. Right, so we're hearing that the United States is spreading democracy and freedom around the world, but this is what the Guardian newspaper is reporting. The poll finds support for democracy remains high, even though citizens in democratic countries rate their government's handling of the COVID crisis less well than people in the less democratic countries. All right, and this is sad because, you know, we tend to think that we have more freedom in the Western world, where we think we have more democracies, right? And it says here, inequality is seen as the biggest threat to global democracy. But in the US, the power of big tech companies is also seen as a challenge. The findings come in a poll commissioned by the Alliance of Democracies Foundation among 50,000 respondents in 53 countries. All right, so people are seeing that in Western civilization, particularly in the United States, perhaps also in the United Kingdom, that democracy might not be what we think it is, right? And even in the treatment of COVID, people did not find the response, the pandemic response, to be something, to be a response or responses with which they were happy, right? It means, therefore, that that is something that governments, Western governments, need to look into. Whole controversy as controversy, rather, as Israel and US labeled biggest threats to world peace, right? And we see here, I think this is coming from the EU Observer, right? And it says over half of Europeans think that, are you seeing? Yes, I am sharing my screen. Think that Israel now presents the biggest threat to world peace, according to a controversial poll requested by the European Commission. All right, so this is something to think about, because as we hear in the media being trumpeted every day in our ears, right, that the US is spreading freedom and democracy around the world, then we need to rethink, because is that what people are saying, the ordinary man on the street, or is that what our elite governments want to foist upon us? And I think the latter is true. Now, let me come here to a letter that was written from the Herald Times. And this letter was published on January 24, 2022. So this is also quite a recent piece. It's not the most recent, but it is quite a recent piece. And it says, letter, it's no wonder Russia feels threatened, all right? According to a recent international Gallup poll, the United States is overwhelmingly considered the greatest threat to world peace, with Pakistan, China, North Korea, Israel, and Iran in that order trailing distantly behind. The Iraq, Afghanistan, and Vietnam wars cost trillions of dollars and killed millions of people, mostly civilians. We now regret starting them, and never would have if we'd had a basic understanding of the situation we were getting into. Now, I understand what the writer is saying, what the author of this piece is saying, but I disagree with him in the sense that I do not think the war hawks, the warmongers, the war, those who support war, the advocates of war, I am not sure that they are, you know, they feel a sense of remorse. I do not think so. I think that they're happy because remember we said that the wars are not fought to be won. As far as the United States is concerned, they are fought to expand the empire, right? So what you think might be victory to you is not what the imperium, what the rulers of the imperium think is victory to them, right? Or what is victory for them. So we need to take that in, we need to bear this in mind. The government is not representing you, or the empire is not representing the ordinary, the civilians, right? They have other financial as well as other political interests, perhaps in some cases religious interests that they are defending. And it's time for us to understand that there is a divergence. There is no coherence between our interests and the interests of the politicians and the financial elites. Right? And that is why many times things are not making sense to you. You think, wow, this does not make any sense. It's not adding up. Yes, it's not adding up because it was not meant to add up. Right? And that is what we need to digest and what we need to understand. We're about to embark on a new war with Russia, a far more formidable foe. Full-scale nuclear conflagration isn't inconceivable. Those who underrate the possibility of nuclear apocalypse haven't looked carefully at the numerous times we've come close in the past. All right, and he continues, consider the Russians' point of view. Since the hopeful days of the, I think this is what I wanted. We're teetering on the edge of unimaginable horror. Why aren't Americans who yearn for a peaceful world speaking out? Why aren't you? So the author here is telling us that this is something that we need to think about, that the United States and Western civilization in particular, or by extension, right, is teetering on the brink of collapse. And we might be losing our freedoms anytime soon. And he's asking, why aren't people talking about it? Why aren't Americans who yearn for a peaceful world speaking out? Why aren't you? Now, remember we said that even though we separate the evils of the government from the ordinary civilians, but God holds us accountable too, right? And we must let our voices, and we also should act in a very, we should be people of integrity. So we should not only speak in terms of saying that we want peace, but we also should live peacefully within our neighborhoods. If we are living and having constant fights with our families, with our neighbors, then we are not necessarily being an example to the government. All right, so we need to live or to lead exemplary lives so the government can see that we're just not talking like them, but we're also acting. We do not only talk the talk, but we walk the talk, right? Because the government often talk the talk, but they often do not walk the talk. They do not do what they say they have promised in words. Their actions are totally lacking where that is concerned. Now, this is an article I pulled up from Truth Out. I think it's coming from the newspaper Truth Dig. I think it's defunct. It's no longer in operation, but I think this was a very good piece, and I thought of sharing some aspects of it with you. The title of the article, and it's written by C.J. Polychronio, right? And it was written on November 2021. So it is still quite recent. It was not a long time ago that this was written. And the title of the article is People Worldwide Name US as a Major Threat to World Peace. Here's why. And oftentimes, notice that most of the quotations that I've shown to you, is suggesting that people outside of the United States, they are the ones who understand that the US is a threat or is a major threat. It's not only a threat, but a major one to world peace because they have experienced, right, the operations of the US military and they understand what the US is capable of doing. Most US citizens, because they do not study US foreign policies, are not aware of what the imperium is doing outside of the United States, right? And if you are not a diligent student of history and languages and cultures, you might not know, right? And the media has a way of saying, oh, these are conspiracies, because it sounds so crude, right? When they begin to unveil the savage acts of US military undertakings, sometimes you really wonder if you are reading about actions of human beings or you are reading about actions of savage beasts of nature. You do wonder sometimes. And I can tell you that sometimes I'm reading some of these history books, particularly the ones from Central America, South America, and the US involvement in these countries and what they've done. And it's very difficult to leaf through those books. It's very difficult to go through that without wanting to throw up. Because you really wonder, can people be so evil? The torture, the level of brutality is indescribable. Now, he's saying from the perspective of humanity and the planet, the war on terror has been catastrophic in its levels of destruction, right? So how is it that people across the globe have come to agree that the United States is now one of the primary threats to world peace and democracy? That's the question being asked. He's opening up his article with that particular question, with this question, right? Having leveled 2 Japanese cities with atomic bombs and established itself as the world's top superpower following the collapse of the international order in the aftermath of World War II, the US quickly became intoxicated by its newfound military superiority, right? So it thinks that it is the lone superpower from then. And even though it told us that the Soviet Union was the competitor, the Soviet Union was never, as we're learning now, ever a challenge to the United States. The Soviet Union was no threat to the United States. All of these are myths that we learned in school. That's one of the myths that we have to unlearn. And if you go to if you study World War II and the history of World War II, you will see that it was not the Soviet Union's intention to enter into a war against the West, specifically the United States. Because remember, I remember after World War II that the Soviet Union had lost in its war against Germany over 26 million people. I think some historians says over 27 million people that they had lost. That was a lot of people to have died, right? So I do not think in any way that the Soviet Union was any major threat to the United States, even immediately after World War II, not to mention thereafter. The US soon went on to introduce a doctrine that positioned itself as the world's police, dropped more bombs in the Korean and Vietnamese wars than there had been dropped in the whole world, in the whole course rather of World War II, and orchestrate military coups against democratically elected governments throughout Latin America. It ended up in turn supporting brutal dictatorships and establishing more foreign military bases than any other nation or empire in history all over the globe. All of this occurred within the first 30 or so days after the end of World War II. By the time the 21st century came around, the US was the only military and economic superpower in the world. Yet, that did not put an end to US imperial ambitions. A global war on terrorism was initiated in the aftermath of the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, with the US ending up by 2013 being seen by people around the world as the greatest threat to world peace. And notice that this was 2013 under President Barack Obama. Bush started the war on terror, and Obama escalated it. He continued it, and Trump did it too with the drone wars, right? With the use of drones, right? That killed many people around the world. Now, the question that he's asking here in this article, what are the roots? Because we must learn the roots of any problem that we are trying to understand, right? One of the reasons why we're not, for example, eradicating the diseases in the world, we think we have, but in many cases we haven't, right? And if we have eradicated one, then we get the surfacing of many more. Right. So it's because, one of the reasons why we're not eradicating diseases or we're not minimizing them is because we're not studying the root causes of diseases. Right. We try to deal with the symptoms, but we do not look at the root and try to understand and try to cure the root cause of the problem. And the same thing we're doing in the political realm, that oftentimes we assume that, something is happening in the political world but it's not the root, it's not the major cause. For example, the US is not doesn't have a war in the Middle East because it wants to defend Israel, as we have been told. We know that it has an imperial war. It's waging an imperial quest for full spectrum dominance. It wants to control the entire world, and it has to control certain choke points, certain parts of the world, so that its power, its hegemony will be unmatched and be no one can compete. No one will compete with it, right? It wants to be the lone superpower, if you will. What has been the impact of imperial expansion and wars on democracy at home? Is the US empire in retreat? In this interview, scholar and activist Puri Peterson Smith, who is Michael Ratner Middle East Fellow at the Institute of Policy Studies, discusses how US imperialism has undermined democracy both home and abroad, with the wars abroad even being tied to police brutality at home. Now, I just wanted to look at one aspect of the interview. I'll post this article in the description box at the end of the program, so you can read it for yourself. But here the journalist is asking the question, or the interviewer, CG, so he's going to open up CG Polychrony. The US has a long history of war on terror campaigns going all the way back to the spread of anarchism in the late 19th century. During the Cold War era, communists were routinely labeled as terrorists. As we are seeing now in the war on terror, that people who disagree, dissidents, often are called terrorists, right? If you don't agree with the US imperium and its wars, or whatever policy it is waging abroad, or even at home, then you are deemed a terrorist. And the first systematic war on terror unfolded during the Reagan administration. Following the September 11 attacks, the Bush administration renewed the war on terror by implementing a series of far-reaching policy initiatives, many of which, incidentally, went unnoticed by the public, but also continued during the Obama and Trump administrations, respectively, which subverted democracy and the rule of law. Can you elaborate about the impact of war on terror policies in the dismantling of the US democracy. Now listen to what Curry, rather, Peterson Smith is going to say. His response is, it's true. The tactics and beliefs that the US has deployed in the war on terror have deep roots that stretch well before our current time. I would argue that the US has never been a democracy, right? And that a key reason is its basically permanent state of war, which began with its founding. Now, this goes back to Revelation 13, where we say that this two-horned land beast came up. So it was like, as the Bible says, that it was a lamb-like beast, right? So even though it behaved through its constitution like a lamb, its values were lamb-like, right? Because they said that they believe that all human beings are created in the image of God and are equal, right? But it did not practice that, right? So it behaved it behaved totally different from what it had purported to be. Correct? And I often say, and I hope, this is my opinion now, that, the United States is a bipolar nation, that, it has this way of saying today it's nice, and it has been nice to people. We're not going to say that. The United States has been good to a large number of people around the world, right? It's a country of freedom, right? And many persons have gone there, and they have done exceptionally well. But at the same time, it goes abroad and it displaces hundreds of thousands of people, right? And many people immigrate to that country, to the United States, because they have been displaced by the wars, whether it's economic war or it is a proxy war or whatever type of war that is being waged in their countries. They have to flee, right? And so you really wonder. So you see that double-edged sword that people have to contend with, which is called the United States of America, right? So God has blessed this country. He has set it up by giving it a constitution that is rooted in biblical principles and values. But oftentimes, these values and principles are not honored because of the blessings God. And the same thing happened to the Jews. They were blessed by God, but they thought their blessings were to be used to exalt themselves instead of exalting God, who gave them, who is the source of all blessings and wisdom and knowledge and understanding. All right, so that's what the US is doing. But we ought not to recognize that it also has done some good in the world. But it does not mean, therefore, that God is going to just look. I'm sure the Jews did some good in the world too, right? They have done some good in the world. But when God decided to curse them and to leave their temple desolate, was because he had given them so much knowledge and had been patient with them. He had given them so much light. He had prospered them beyond description. But they had become stubborn, obstinate, and they wanted to go in their own way. And this is what the United States is doing now. She wants the taste of world dominion, to see what it means to be the cop. She likes when she is called the cop, the police of the world, and that people have to do what she orders them to do, what she mandates that they do. Right? And that is why Lord Action says what power corrupts, is absolutely, and absolute power corrupts. Absolutely. It's something of the sort. I'm not remembering Lord Action's quote, but we know that absolute power corrupts, Absolutely. So the fact of the matter is that we have to understand that the US is intoxicated with political power, with its military power and genius, with its technological power, with its scientific power, that it wants to dominate the world. And we can see where little by little it's losing some parts of its power. The economic part is dwindling slowly but surely. Right? So we have to take stock of that too. Now, New England settlers, for example, waged a war of counterinsurgency against indigenous peoples here who resisted colonization in King Philip's War. The settlers besieged indigenous nations, considering communities of adults and children to be enemies and punishing them with incredible violence. And this was in the 1670s. All right, let's just look at one more question and see its answer, and then we have to stop here. I can't go further. I would argue that the US has never been a democracy. Well, he says that it's never been a democracy. I think we've read the book before. He goes into other aspects of the history. In a different US counterinsurgency in the Philippines in the early 20th century, American soldiers used the water cure, torture tactic comparable to the waterboarding that the US has used in the war on terror. This was one feature of a horrific war of scorched earth that the US waged as Filipino revolutionaries fought for an independent country after Spanish colonization. The US killed tens of thousands of Filipino fighters and hundreds of thousands, up to 1 million civilians. Think about that happened in 1898. I'm not sure what the population size of the Filipinos was, but the Filipino is not necessarily a massive country. So if we're going to talk about losing 1 million civilians, that's a lot, right? And this is in 1898. There was also a staggering amount of death due to secondary violence, such as starvation and cholera outbreaks, and due to the US declaration that civilians were fair game to target, as seen in the infamous Balangija massacre. It was during that episode in 1901 on the island of Samar when an American general ordered troops to kill everyone over the age of 10. The designation of whole populations as the enemy, and therefore targets for violence, has echoes that reverberate in Somalia, Yemen, Iraq, and other places where the US has fought the war on terror. So this war on terror did not begin on September 11 or after September 11, 2001. It was intensified, right? But it had its genesis. Its seeds were planted way long before, from at least 1898. And if we go back to slavery, we can say that its seeds were planted even from then. And then some people might say back to the war on the Native Americans. All right. But I think that the 1898 was when the US officially self-described. It was self-described as an empire. It was now realizing that it really was growing rapidly and was even becoming more powerful than Great Britain, which was then the contending world empire. This is to say that there are different chapters in the history of US empire, but there is a thorough line of justifying military violence and the denial of human rights in defense of US power and the American way of life. This history of wars informs those of the present. In the 20th century, labeling various activities terrorism was the way of rationalizing the use of force. The US did this especially with its allies in response to anti-colonial liberation movements. So the South African apartheid regime called anti-apartheid resistance terrorism, and the Israeli state did and continues to do the same to Palestinian resistance, however nonviolent. The US has armed and defended these states, embracing and promoting the rhetoric of war against terrorism. So it has armed these states and it is defending them in their quest to kill their opponents. Now, the flip side of terrorism, the blanket enemy against which all violence is justified, is democracy, the all-encompassing thing that US claims to defend in its foreign policy. But again, the 20th century saw the US embrace, arm and wage war with and on behalf of anti-democratic dictatorial forces on every continent. This is serious. The decades of violence that the US carried out and supported throughout Latin America in the latter part of the 20th century in response to waves of popular resistance from social and economic justice serve as a brutal chapter of examples. Hear what he's saying here now. To answer your question more directly, military violence always requires dehumanization and the denial of rights. And this inevitably corrupts any notions of democracy. War, in fact, always involves an attack on democratic rights at large. When the US launched the war on terror in 2001, the federal government simultaneously waged military campaigns abroad and passed legislation like the USA Patriot Act, issued legal guidelines and other practices that introduced new levels of surveillance, denial of due process, rationalization of torture, and other attacks on civil liberties. These efforts especially targeted Muslims and people of South Asian, Central Asian, Southwest Asian, and North African origin, all of whom were subject to being cast as terrorists or suspected terrorists. And now we're learning that the Biden administration is going after people who speak against Jews because he wants to protect them, or they're talking about Islamophobia. Now, what is Islamophobia? Who has more Islamophobia than the US military-industrial complex? All right, but now they are going on campus, the university campuses in the United States, and they are going after students who might express anti-Muslim sentiments, whatever that means. But if you express anti-Jew or anti-Muslim sentiments, you can be deemed a terrorist. It is worth noting that while Bush drew upon the deep roots of US violence to launch the war on terror, there has been incredible continuity, escalation, and expansion throughout it. Bush launched the drone war, for example, and President Barack Obama then widely expanded and escalated it. President Donald Trump then escalated it further. So we're seeing here that all of the presidents, not only one, they escalate these violence. So whether you're on the political right or you're on the political left, the US is still an empire. All right, so let us call it the right-wing empire. It's both the right-wing empire and the left-wing empire. Right? In fact, Chalmers Johnson says that, it divides the citizens and polarizes them, and it puts one, it calls its name. So from the political right, that's the Republican Party, they say that that United States should have a unilateral rule and control over the world. And from the perspective of the Democratic Party, well, he was giving his views year from, because he died in 2010, from 2005 when that book was published, the Sorrows of Empire. So the Sorrows of Empire, rather. But the fact of the matter is that the Democrats, I should say, he was suggesting, they tend to claim that their empire should be called, a humanitarian empire. And from the humanitarian empire, that is where we get this the whole matter of it's spreading freedom and democracy. But that is not true. Right? The agenda is the same, but the approach, and we got into the approach is different because it's killing people on both sides. But it's couched in a more, should I say, euphemistic language from the left perspective. And many people think that they're progressive, do not understand that the United States is still an empire. Whether it says that it is a humanitarian empire, it's spreading, freedom and democracy around the world, because it is not. It is there to control because that is what all empires of the world do. All right. So the answer to the question, is the US an empire? Yes, it is an empire. Should we be concerned about what it's doing in the world, the killing of hundreds of thousands of people? Yes, we should be concerned. Should we be raising our voices in writing and in speaking? Yes, we should be raising our voices, right? Through our pens, meaning that you can pen letters to the editor, you can write opinion pieces to various newspaper outlets. I must say, however, that the mainstream media are selective in what pieces they choose to publish in their newspapers, because they do not want the public to be informed and to be aware of what's going on. Because it's the purpose of the elites to control the people that they do not rise up against them. Right? So I just wanted to come here today to just sensitize you another time, once more, to letting you know that we are not living in ordinary times, and that it is time for us now to begin to read about, to study, not only just read, but to study. We need to get into diligent studies. When people come over to your homes, don't just have them over to eat food and to laugh and to watch TV. In fact, it's time to turn off the televisions. Why don't you have book clubs and read good books and discuss books so that you can educate yourself and educate your children? Because remember now, when the US begins to speak like a dragon, it's not going to be concerned whether you are a citizen, you're a child, you're a baby, it will not care. Right? And it is beginning to speak like a dragon in other places of the world, but it's going to speak like a dragon, more like a dragon, as it continues to wage war around the world. Right? Remember now that to some extent, to some degree, the Constitution still puts a check on US power and on US militarism. But as soon as all principles are taken from the Constitution, right? As soon as they are eradicated, then she will speak like a dragon, as the Bible says. And the Bible is always correct, right? It spoke very, very well and explicitly about the uprising and also the downfall of previous empires, including Babylon, Medo Persia, Greece, Rome, under pagan Rome, under papal Rome. And it happened just as the Bible had predicted. Right? So the Bible was right in those times. It is going to be right in our times. So we must understand that man, being in honor and understandeth not, is like the beasts that perish. Thank you so much for joining, and I look forward to seeing you in another conversation. Thank you.